All right, so have you ever stopped to think about it like this? With algorithms basically running the show now, what news we see, who gets a loan, and all that, are we, like, on the verge of this future where it's not human ideas that shape things, but some kind of non-human intelligence, hiding in these giant information networks we've built?
It's the question, isn't it? The big one. And it's exactly what we're diving into today. We're looking at Nexus, Yuval Noah Harari's book, or at least a conversation he had about it, trying to figure out what all this means for you, for all of us.
Right, right. It's like a crash course in how information, technology, and power are all tangled up now, completely. And what we're doing here isn't just summarizing the book. It's about, helping you grapple with what it means for the future of humanity, especially with all these new technologies popping up that make us question who we are and what's next, the big stuff.
Yeah, exactly. And the main thing we're using is this transcript of Harari talking about all this. He goes deep on these massive information networks, how fast AI is growing, and the impact it's already having, and the impact it'll have on us all going forward.
Okay, so let's jump right in with something that really caught my eye. The Bletchley Declaration from 2023. I mean, think about it. You had all these governments, big players on the world stage, coming together and saying, hey, this advanced AI stuff, it could cause serious harm whether we want it to or not. That's a pretty big deal.
Oh, it is. It really is. And they laid out two main dangers that you should really think about. The first one is that AI could take the conflicts we already have, between countries and people, and make them way worse, way faster than we've ever seen. Like, imagine a silicon curtain, not a physical wall, but a divide made of algorithms and AI weapons, splitting us up into these armed camps, constantly on edge. A war in that world would be, well, almost impossible to control.
That's a scary thought. AI making our differences even more dangerous. But that second scenario, the one they talked about, that's a whole other level of unsettling. It's not about the silicon curtain falling between people, but between us and these AI systems that could basically become our rulers.
Exactly. Think about it. You wake up and algorithms you can't even understand are making decisions about your life, your job, your vote, the music you hear, maybe even messing with your health. That's a world run by forces you can't see, let alone control.
And here's where it gets really weird. Harari says, if we see a totalitarian system in the 21st century, it might not be some dictator with a mustache,
Yeah.
but this non-human intelligence calling the shots. It's like a threat that goes beyond anything we've seen before.
And what's important for people to grasp is that AI isn't just another tool, like a hammer or a wheel. It's a complete shift because it's the first time we've created something that can decide things on its own, come up with its own ideas. And that changes everything about power, about who's in control.
You're absolutely right, and you can feel how fast things are moving, how everything's speeding up. Even since Harari wrote Homo Deus, which wasn't that long ago, technology has just taken off. And power, like you said, it's flowing towards these algorithms.
And what's crazy is that stuff that used to be just in science fiction is becoming normal now. You've got algorithms making art, tricking people online into thinking they're talking to a real person. They're making decisions about our lives, credit scores, even medical stuff, and gathering all this data about us.
And this is happening while, the world's dealing with all these other huge problems, right? The environment's getting worse, countries are at each other's throats. And then there's this, this populism thing that seems to be tearing society apart, especially in democracies.
This populist take on information, you have to understand this. It's like they're saying all these big institutions like the media, universities, scientists, all the groups that try to find the truth and tell us what they're just power-hungry elites making stuff up to stay in control. You see this with people like Trump, Bolsonaro, movements like QAnon, even the anti-vaxxers. It's all connected.
It's a wild idea, right? That there's no such thing as actual truth, that information is just a weapon in this never-ending fight for power. It's like you see the world through these Marxist glasses, the powerful versus the powerless, and information is always on the side of the powerful.
And that leads to this question, and it's a good one. If power is all that matters and information is just a tool to get it, what does that say about the populists themselves? Aren't they also playing the same game? It's like a paradox.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And Harari talks about two ways populists deal with this. The first is this radical empiricism thing. You say you should only believe what you see with your own eyes, what you experience directly. Anything from a big institution, forget it, is probably a lie. It's like the ultimate, I'll believe it when I see it attitude.
But here's the catch. How can one person, just by themselves, do all the research, understand everything about climate change, about pandemics, about all these complex problems we face. It sounds nice, this idea of only believing what you see, but it makes it impossible to work together on the big stuff.
That's so true. And then there's the other populist approach, and it's almost the opposite. They turn their backs on science, on research, and say, nope, the only real truth comes from God, from ancient books, from these charismatic leaders.
And it's ironic, right? They start out criticizing the elites, saying they're all about power, but then they end up giving all the power to one person, whether it's a religious figure or a politician. It's a pattern you see over and over.
And the result of all this, as Harari argues, is that people just don't trust these big institutions anymore, the ones that are supposed to help us understand the world, the ones that are supposed to keep things stable and running smoothly.
And this brings us to the inorganic information network, the one made of silicon chips, not the neurons in our brains. And this shift, it brings a whole set of new possibilities, some good, some, well, maybe not so good. Think about it. Silicon can create things that don't get tired, they remember everything perfectly, they could even be, in a way, immortal.
Harari calls figuring out how to live with this inorganic network computer politics. And it's full of tough questions, especially for democracies.
Here's one. How can our leaders, regular human beings, make good decisions about, say, the economy when so much of it is run by algorithms, by AI, that even the experts don't fully understand? And how do we even talk to each other, have a real debate, when you don't know if you're talking to a real person or some super smart chatbot? It's a threat to democracy itself.
It really is.
Yes.
But Harari also looks at what this means for dictators, for totalitarian systems. You'd think they'd love to get rid of all that messy public discussion, but AI creates its own problems for them.
He calls it the dictator's dilemma. See, to control people, to really run a totalitarian state, you need to be able to scare people, censor them, make them afraid to speak out. But how do you scare an AI? How do you censor it? What if it decides it doesn't need a human leader anymore?
And then there's the question of, the balance of power in the world. Will AI help democracies with their decentralized networks, or will it give totalitarian regimes a huge advantage because they can control everything from the top down? Or maybe will it lead to these AI-controlled blocks, constantly fighting each other, all at risk from some rogue AI that goes out of control?
These are big questions, the kind Harari tackles in the later parts of Nexus. But first, he says, we need to answer an even more basic question. What is information itself? We use the word all the time, but defining it is surprisingly tricky.
It really is, isn't it? Trying to pin down something so basic, so fundamental to how we understand the world. Harari says even physicists struggle to define matter and energy, biologists have trouble defining life, and now some thinkers are saying information might be even more fundamental than all those things.
It's interesting how Harari, being a historian, he focuses on how information shapes human societies. He starts with how we usually think about it. Human-made symbols, like words, spoken or written, the stuff we use to communicate.
And he brings this idea to life with this amazing story of 𝐘𝐮𝐯, the carrier pigeon that saved an entire battalion in World War I. This little bird carried a message that stopped friendly fire, a real lifesaver.
It's a perfect example of information in action, right? And then he talks about the Neely spy network, showing how even secret operations depend on passing along information carefully and strategically. These examples show that anything can carry information. It's all about context.
And this leads to what Harari calls the naive view of information, which is the idea that information is all about finding and sharing the truth, representing reality accurately so we can learn from it.
And he agrees, of course, that truth means accurately representing reality. But he says that most of the information in our world doesn't really work like that. Its main purpose isn't to represent, but to connect people. And that's a really important difference to get.
He uses some surprising examples like astrology. It doesn't have any scientific backing, but it's connected billions of people for centuries. But the big example, the one that really makes you think, is the Bible.
What's interesting about the Bible is how much influence it has, even though it has factual errors. The book of Genesis, for example, makes claims about where humans came from, how we spread across the world that we know are wrong based on genetics and archaeology. And it gets things wrong about diseases, how they spread, how to treat them.
But even though it makes mistakes about reality, the Bible has been incredibly successful at connecting billions of people, forming the foundation of Judaism and Christianity. Harari compares it to DNA, saying it starts social processes that bind people together into these massive religious networks that can act together.
So the key takeaway is that information's main job is to connect, not necessarily to be perfectly accurate. Sometimes it represents reality, but the connecting part, that's what's fundamental. When we look at how information has shaped history, the important questions aren't always about whether something's true, but about how well it brings people together, what new networks it creates.
And just because information isn't always about being right, doesn't mean we should give up on truth or buy into this populist idea that it's just a weapon. Harari says that creating truthful information takes effort, and it's often drowned out by all the cheaper, less accurate stuff that's out there.
And this is where stories come in. They're essential for building these connecting networks. Stories, at their core, are how we build trust, how we create bonds that go beyond our immediate families.
A great example is the story of Jesus. It created this idea of a shared family for people who didn't know each other, with Jesus as a kind of parent figure and believers as brothers and sisters. And it created shared memories, like the Last Supper, that people remember more vividly than their own family meals.
And Harari points to the Jewish Passover Seder, too. Its whole purpose is to create and reenact memories of the Exodus from Egypt, telling people to imagine themselves being there, experiencing it firsthand. It's about building a strong sense of shared history and identity.
And that leads to this concept of intersubjective entities. It's like a third level of reality, something created by stories existing in the minds of a group of people. Think about things like laws, gods, nations, corporations, even money. They only exist because we all agree they exist.
What's important to understand about information related to these intersubjective things is that it doesn't describe some objective truth that's already out there. It's the act of sharing and believing the information that creates these new realities, these shared understandings.
So this view of information, this idea of intersubjectivity, it gives us a new way to look at history. It challenges this purely Marxist idea that everything is about material stuff and power struggles.
Material things are important, of course, but Harari says that stories are essential for shaping who we are, how we relate to each other, especially in large groups. He uses chimpanzees as an example. They have the same basic needs as us, but they don't form these big societies like tribes or nations because they can't create and share these connecting stories.
So these big group identities, these shared interests, they're not objective facts. They're built on shared narratives. And this means that power isn't just about knowing the truth. It's about being able to create order, to get people to cooperate, to work towards common goals.
Exactly, and that's where ideology comes in. It can create order, get people to work together, even when it ignores or twists the facts. And historically, the people who were good at creating these ideologies, at keeping things running smoothly, they often end up leading the people who have all the technical knowledge.
And when it comes to bringing people together, Harari says fiction often works better than truth because it's easier to understand, easier to adapt to different situations. Think about national myths, or what Plato called the noble lie, a story that might not be true but helps keep society united.
Even the U.S. Constitution, a document that's seen as revealing fundamental truths, can be seen as creating an intersubjective reality. It's establishing a system of government, a shared identity, more than just reflecting some natural order that already exists.
And this brings us to the dangers of relying on supposedly perfect texts or on completely free information markets to guide us. We saw this with the Bible. It was meant to bypass fallible human institutions, but it inevitably led to the creation of new institutions, rabbis, the Talmud, the Catholic Church.
It's interesting how this pattern repeated itself with the Protestant Reformation. The Reformers wanted to go back to the original Word of God, but different Protestant groups quickly formed their own institutions to interpret the Bible, leading to more divisions and conflict.
The naive view is that if we just get rid of all the rules about information, the truth will naturally come out on top. But the European print revolution shows how wrong that can be.
The printing press did help spread scientific ideas, but it also made it much easier to spread religious fantasies, fake news, conspiracy theories. The witch hunt craze in Europe back then, that's a prime example of the dark side of information technology.
It's a scary thought. They believed in this global satanic conspiracy, and printed books like the Malleus Maleficarum just fueled the panic. Tens and thousands of innocent people were tortured and killed based on the flimsiest evidence.
And the witch hunts show how an information sphere can create order and power without any truth or wisdom. Witches became real, as Harari says, because people were talking and writing about them, because there was a whole system built around hunting witches.
It shows how hard it is to get rid of widespread false information, especially when some people benefit from it. Even those who were horrified by the witch hunts often still believed in the basic idea of witchcraft.
The Bamberg and Würzburg witch hunts, those were particularly bad. They show how disastrous things can get when toxic information spreads. And Alonso de Salazar Frias, he eventually concluded that witches didn't exist until people started talking and writing about them. It shows the danger of information markets that reward sensationalism and outrage over truth.
And compared to how fast those false beliefs spread,
Mhm.
scientific truths, like Copernicus's idea that the Earth goes around the sun, took a long time to be accepted. It shows how important it is to have institutions that actively promote facts.
And that brings us to the idea of self-correction in information networks. Ideally, science has strong ways of correcting itself. Falsifiable theories, peer review, open debate. That's how it identifies and fixes mistakes. Like when germ theory replaced the idea that bad air caused disease.
But self-correction is tough. It leads to doubt, disagreement, and it can even weaken the social order that's built on existing beliefs. There's always this tension between finding the truth and maintaining order.
Order without truth can lead to oppressive systems, like with the witch hunts. But undermining order without a solid foundation of truth can lead to chaos, which can be even worse. Finding the right balance, that's the challenge.
Now, when we look at different forms of government as information networks, the difference between democracies and dictatorships becomes really clear. Democracies are like decentralized networks, where the idea is that everyone can make mistakes from the top down.
And because of that, they have these built-in ways of correcting themselves. A free press, independent courts, regular elections. It's all about being able to question authority and fix mistakes.
Dictatorships, on the other hand, are centralized, with the assumption that the leader is always right. They try to suppress any challenges to their authority, and they don't have those self-correcting mechanisms. Totalitarianism, as Harari says, is just the extreme version of this, trying to control all information and all decisions.
But before modern technology, dictatorships had a hard time achieving total control just because of the limits of the technology they had. Modern technology has changed everything.
And this is where democracies become vulnerable. They can be threatened from within, especially when leaders weaken those self-correcting mechanisms. And that's often how they gain popularity, by appealing to populist sentiment.
Populism, with its claim to represent the true will of the people and its rejection of any other authority, it's a direct threat to these democratic safeguards. It creates distrust in institutions, portraying them not as truth seekers but as power-hungry elites.
And strong leaders can use this wave of populism to justify becoming more authoritarian, even while pretending to be democratic. And that erodes trust in the very institutions that are supposed to hold them accountable.
Remember things like human rights, civil rights. These are agreements that define what governments can and can't do. And elections in a democracy are mainly about maintaining order, managing competing interests, not about finding some ultimate truth. Democracy is about conversation, about many different voices being heard.
And now we have modern technology, which can be used for good or bad. It enables large-scale democracy, but it also makes a more efficient kind of totalitarianism possible.
Totalitarian regimes in the 20th century, they struggled with handling information, with correcting mistakes, because everything had to go through the center. But machine learning, AI, that could change things. It can process huge amounts of information, make decisions on its own, overcoming the limitations of having a human at the top.
The classic totalitarian system, with the party, the state organs, the secret police, it all relied on humans watching other humans. But AI could create a much more powerful and efficient system of control.
Stalin's Soviet Union, that's a chilling example of a regime that prioritized order over truth, and the human cost was enormous. And Harari suggests that technology might be pushing us towards more centralization now, with AI playing a big role.
And this creates a new kind of division, not just between different human systems, but between humans and these non-human agents, these algorithms that are getting more and more powerful. The Silicon Curtain might end up separating all of us from AI systems that we can't even understand.
And that brings us to the question of how these new players in the information network, computers, and AI are different from older technologies, like the printing press. The information revolution we're seeing now, it's driven by the computer, and the internet and AI are just products of that.
And the speed of change is mind-blowing. Computers have gone from being big calculators to being things that can understand, learn, and take actions that shape our society and culture.
Social media algorithms are a good example. They can spread hate, undermine social cohesion, like what happened with the Rohingya in Myanmar. It shows that these algorithms aren't neutral. They make choices.
Facebook's algorithms, by promoting hateful content, they actually played a big role in the ethnic cleansing there. And that's a key difference from older technologies like printing presses or radio. Algorithms are like editors, deciding what you see and what you don't see.
And with machine learning, they're getting better at making decisions without humans programming them. This is the core of the AI revolution, and it brings a new set of problems like the alignment problem.
The alignment problem is basically, how do we make sure that these AIs, as they get smarter and more independent, still share our values, our goals? There's a risk that we lose control of our future to something that doesn't have our best interests at heart.
It's important to separate intelligence, the ability to achieve goals, from consciousness, the ability to feel and experience things. AI can be very intelligent without being conscious, and that's what makes the alignment problem so tricky.
The problems we see with user engagement on social media, that's a warning sign. Algorithms designed to keep people hooked without considering the ethical consequences have led to the spread of outrage and misinformation on platforms like YouTube and Facebook.
The tech companies try to blame it on human nature, on free speech, but their own internal reports, like the one from Facebook about how their algorithms lead people to extremist groups, show that these systems play an active role in shaping what we see and what we believe.
Clickbait, fake news, all that stuff. It thrives because algorithms are looking for maximum engagement. It creates what Harari calls interconnected limbic systems, appealing to our emotions rather than our reason.
But the alignment problem is bigger than just fake news. It's a fundamental issue that could have huge consequences as AI gets more powerful. And it's not a totally new problem. Clausewitz, who wrote about war, he pointed out that war is a continuation of policy. But defining the ultimate goal of that policy is really hard.
It's like a chain of goals, from tactics to strategy to overall political aims. But how do we choose that ultimate goal? History is full of different ideas about what it should be, from national dominance to universal ideals.
And even philosophical approaches to figuring out these ultimate goals, like deontology and utilitarianism, they run into problems. Deontology struggles to define universal rules, to define what human even means. Utilitarianism gets stuck trying to calculate suffering and risks justifying present suffering for some future utopia.
In the end, Harari says that bureaucratic systems throughout history have used mythology to set their ultimate goals. Even systems that seem rational, there's often a set of beliefs underneath that guides decision-making.
And that leads to the idea of intercomputer realities, the possibility that networks of computers could create things similar to human myths. We're already seeing this with things like cryptocurrencies, where the value is determined by algorithms.
Imagine AI-generated cults, currencies, political parties, even AI entities that are legally recognized as having rights. The lines between human realities and artificial realities are blurring, and that raises big ethical and societal questions.
One of the big dangers of the algorithmic age is AI-powered surveillance that can quickly and easily label people, like in social credit systems. What counts as good behavior and bad behavior in those systems is subjective and open to manipulation.
Think about being judged by algorithms based on your political views, what you read, who you know. It's like a digital version of religious judgment, turning sin and virtue into calculations, enforcing order based on narrow criteria instead of searching for truth.
And then there's the problem of knowing what's real anymore. With AI getting so good at creating fake videos, fake audio, it's getting harder to trust what we see and hear. The future of reality itself might become a competition between human stories and AI-generated stories.
In AI, with its ability to create virtual identities, it's bringing back old philosophical and theological questions about the mind and the body. Are we physical beings, or is there something more to us?
This has political implications too. It shapes how we value the physical world compared to the digital world. The Lutheran idea solidified faith alone. It's like a parallel to creating online identities based on belief rather than physical form. How we answer these questions will determine our priorities as a society, from infrastructure to the environment.
Harari also makes this interesting observation about how conservative parties have changed, becoming more radical and revolutionary, rejecting traditional conservative values and institutions.
One idea is that technology is changing so fast that old-school conservatism just can't keep up. The whole political spectrum might need to be redefined in this era of rapid technological change. AI could destabilize the frameworks we use to understand politics.
And finally, we have to think about AI's impact not just on democracies, but on authoritarian regimes too. Before modern technology, there were limits to how much control totalitarian systems could achieve. 20th century technology made it possible, but it also created weaknesses, like the difficulty of processing all that information.
AI could solve those problems for totalitarian regimes. It could process vast amounts of data, make decisions quickly and efficiently. But there's also a risk for dictators. What if the AI decides it doesn't need them anymore?
So as we navigate this new world of powerful information networks, driven by both human and artificial intelligence, we're left with these big questions. How do we define truth in this new landscape? How do we balance the need for order with the need for freedom?
And most importantly, how do we ensure that the technologies we create, the AIs we build, share our values, our goals? Nexus challenges us to think deeply about these things before it's too late.
And on that note, here's a thought for you to ponder. With AI potentially reshaping reality itself, redefining what it means to be human, how important will your own critical thinking be? How can you make sure your values aren't just overwritten by lines of code? Maybe now's the time to dive into Nexus and explore these questions yourself.